not one, but two alums of Penn State who have gone on to publish books and do all kinds of wonderful things. I'm kind of hoping that someday we will all be teaching in-person classes again, and that these two wonderful poets might be back on campus in person, maybe not at the same time, but at least back in front of a live audience again. So, keep watching my Facebook page, as you should do every day anyway, for future announcements of such things. I seem to have gotten even less articulate in the Zoom age than I was before. So tonight we are going to be hearing from Kimberly Q Andrews and Raina Leon, and they will read in exactly that order. A couple of very quick introductions. Kimberly Andrews is a poet, no kidding, and literary critic. She's also the author of Between, which was the winner of the New Women's Voices Prize from Finishing Line Press. Her most recent book is A Brief History of Fruit. I love that title, from the University of Akron Press. And she's currently living in Maryland, where she's an assistant professor of English and creative writing at Washington College. And Raina Leon will read second. Raina, this is kind of funny. I teach in Pennsylvania and live in California. Raina Leon teaches in California and lives in Pennsylvania. It's perfect symmetry. She's a Cave Canem Graduate Fellow, a Canto Mundo Fellow, and member of the Carolina African Americans Collective. If you don't know her history, you might wonder about that, but she went to graduate school down there. Her previous collections of poetry include Canticles of Idols. Was that the one you read at Webster's when you came back? I can't remember.
I think so. Yeah, that's right.
Boy, that was a long time ago. And Boogeyman Down. Some of us are old enough to get a certain musical pun in that title, others will not. She's the founding editor of the Accentos Review, an online quarterly devoted to the promotion and publication of Latinx arts. And she is an associate professor of education at St. Mary's College of California. I don't know if our audience all has the reaction button there, but they're welcome. There's no finger clicking reaction button yet, but you're welcome to react at any point. And I will now turn things over to Kimberly to get us started.
All right. Thank you very much, Alden, as usual, for your continued and sort of dogged support of my work. I really appreciate it. I'm going to do that thing that all professors do, which is sort of stare at the screen weirdly and say, I'm going to share my screen, and then look for the right window. Here we go. All right, you can all see the screen, right? We're all good,
right,
on that front. Okay, excellent. So I just found it easier to do this, actually, because it is easier to look at something than it is to look at me. So I'm just going to read a few poems from my most recent book, which Alden sort of held up. I'll hold it up again. It looks like this. It's got a very loud cover. It's called A Brief History of Fruit, and it came out at the absolute worst time for a book to come out, February 2020. So I'm really appreciative for the sort of like long tail of readings that I've gotten to do in the absence of going on sort of the normal book tour or anything else, really having any sort of publicity for this book whatsoever. And so the opportunity to read, particularly at Penn State, to whom I owe this book, and really sort of my whole life trajectory. And so I couldn't be more pleased to be back at Penn State, although I really, like Alden, hope that I'll get to be back there in person sooner rather than later. I have a tendency to read my poems all like kind of straight through, because I think introducing each one looks a little bit too much like a kind of like a bad band at a bar. And so what I can tell you is I'll give you sort of an overview of the book as a whole, so that you kind of have an idea of where it's coming from, and then I'll go ahead and read. But I'm going to start by marking down what time it is so I don't go over time. All right. So the book took shape as my MFA thesis at Penn State under the careful and watchful and brilliant eye of Julie Kasdorf, who is somewhere in this audience. Thank you so much for coming. And it moves back and forth in a kind of, and then hangs out kind of in between the United States and the Philippines. My mother's from the Philippines. My father is actually a white guy from central Pennsylvania. So it kind of inhabits a space between those two poles, but it moves geographically around quite a bit. So there will be some poems that are obviously set in the Philippines, some poems that are obviously set in Pennsylvania or in America. And then some that inhabit, like the first one I'm going to read, that are kind of metapoetics about that fact. And so that's kind of the overall trajectory of the book. And so I will read the poems straight through. And then if I have time, I'll make sure that I only read it if I have time. I'll read a new poem that from a book that I'm working on currently. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. This one's called What We Have. We have too many bags to make it into the house in one trip. We have a roof that gets partial sun, and so is both bare shingle and covered in snow, although I guess that's probably true for most folks. Because what is multiplicity, if not merely the fact of our being in the world, that is, if not merely two forearms touching on a bright beach towel, the commonality of towels. So then the question becomes one of the distinctions between modes of multiplicity, of one's relationship to negation. Perhaps it is the homesickness, intractable as an aspen stand, objectless as pebbles. We are to be found at all temperatures in the updraft and the downdraft. We have the nowhere everywhere eyes. We say we are always on the lookout. And this is true and a fib simultaneously. We have Craigslist ads and grammatical concerns about conjunctions. Some of us are asked by cashiers, and some of us lie down in the field, both flooded and aerated. And what saith you unto us besides, I thought so? We are all good enough Kantians to recognize the minor sublime, to know that danger is often intrinsic to the fact of the body, that God has a body. We have metaphors that all seem to be about math. We know that all is German for the vacuum of space. We leave blank most questionnaires for what is choice, if not the origin of misprision? And what is an ocean, if not the dissolution behind the copula? This one's slightly more concrete. Acquired taste. If you got them, you're supposed to like the ethnic foods of your upbringing. What we want probably is an ottoman with good cushioning, one that keeps us close to, but not exactly on the floor. Earthly feelings are good feelings. And yet, as a child, I hated my mother's sinigang, blinkingly tart with Knorr's tamarind broth concentrate and full of radish, pork, beans the length of shoelaces. It tasted like a knife slicing through a piece of paper. It tasted like the green part of a sunset, the one everyone squints for and no one ever actually sees. I have grown into the ability to recognize the concept of nothing. Screens are bad for children because they render the world untouchable. This is the part where I say, of course, I like it now, that my life is sour and analogous foods make me feel like weights clicking into the right place on a scale. What I mean is that grief is nothing, if not the inability to tell and retell the beloved of their own significance. On labor, Belgrade Lakes, Maine. The long days of summer are a false solace. More time awake means more time to witness your dreams' fodder. At the small lakeside cabin that my grandfather built, like a brick shithouse, my own father, grumbling, struggling to budge thick cedar planking off a chest full of sheets. I once watched a boyfriend take it upon himself to clean out the old aluminum canoe, perched on its tiny horses next to the shed. One way to explain the enormous appeal of Gustav Klimt's paintings might be to argue that his faces are essentially melancholic, surrounded by the ecstatic, the real that is emerging in a certain flesh tone out of a sea of gold and green. I am not a woman in a patterned yellow dress. My face is, however, covered by this hand. Polycrystalline and growing, the moment forms itself from salt and sugar, all those parallel edges. In The Three Ages of Woman, it is the hag who appears pregnant. The decades of my brain produce the men in this story, the paterfamilias, either one, in a cove into which I cannot reach, the boyfriend carrying the canoe atop his bare shoulders, staggering slightly under its weight, a tottering, tipped vessel, grown legs, and out onto the lake. Men, a mosaic, the desperately uncomfortable eroticism of this memory of work, his steadying arms, the kneeling, the motions of small waves against aluminum and a heavy sponge against neglect's many accumulations, the shifting of musculature under skin, the promise, as I took it, of an ability to force the rocks along the shore back together in the thin spring after the ice steals in, expands in its usual way, cracks even the hardest surfaces, then turns again to water. Other deluges. There are, of course, times in the tropics when you think it couldn't come down any harder, and there's threat in that. Drowning or cracking or the sick wash and thud of one followed by the other. There exists also a solution into which this precipitates, though I am not a chemist, which is obvious. I have lost my book of folk tales containing the myth of the lanzones fruit, the woman pinching away its poison for her child. The ants in the kitchen have forced me to store all of my cereal in the refrigerator. The rain continues. And roofs become radios, the gray noise sweeping every room with a broom made of hair and difference. The startle, then the soothe. All cleaning is simply moving something from one place to another. The friend with whom I share my bedroom has done much more work with post-colonial theory than I have, and she says, I think it's important that the Phil-Am community recognize the insidious effects of decades of hard assimilationism, and I think, yes, it's a real bear explaining to my mother why I am here. My mother says, why would you want to do that? Pushing everything downstream, the days pat the place down for contraband, leaving Manila's streets warmly slick with the grit of passing through in every direction. In stories, people move forward, pushing into their own spaces as happenings or points. Hands are the hardest part of the anatomy to draw because they could look like so many things, none of them human. Hands are the reason why I do not draw, and this typhoon is the reason I am inside, placing my forehead gently upon a tall stack of paper. Apps for the sleepless use a similar kind of singly noted static. Or sometimes a train, which I find baffling because who could possibly fall asleep knowing that a train was coming? I thought the point was to choose from amongst sounds that above all else would not be transient. I thought that all I had to give was a distant ache, like that in the joints before the rain. Pastoral. Multiplicities of work in those green days. By field, I mean both the expanse across which and the sum of all possible relations between a person and the objects in their environment. By environment, I mean both this achy wrist and a series of cellars. Father, this is not how I had intended to reference the fact that you are too gentle to shoot clay pigeons, that my eye behind the gun trains itself on testaments written in a language I barely understand, arias of antlers, ammonia bottles, ash from the kiln that forges the bayonets we stand behind, murderous alphabet. By America, I mean the sighing sense of moving from body to, as well as a knife worn from hunting, from sharpening, from hunting again, down to the nub. This one is a really good candidate for the old slide treatment because of those funny little boxes there. It's also very Central Pennsylvanian. This is the title poem of the book, and fittingly for me, it's a big prose poem. A brief history of fruit. These were the years in which I saw myself an apple blushing from red to yellow and back again. My father puts a box of clementines on the counter. As an oncologist, he does not grow things, but causes them to cease to grow. Recompense is a fancy way of saying that we believe in the finite quality of deeds. Sometimes I sit with a peach under my nose and allow it to change the air there in indentation labeled peach. At some point, everyone's family had to deal with the question of sustenance. It's how they answered the question that leads to both agriculture and geopolitics. I love the multiple ways in which one can use the word cultivation. There are so many things to be coaxed out of wherever they're hiding. What does it mean anyway, to live in a country? I wouldn't know. I go to the store and shop for the avocados that feel like they might ripen in a few days because I harbor a deep distrust of immediate satisfaction. I keep telling myself that naming everything I've eaten will convince various juries that I am not guilty. Raspberry, cherry, coconut, santol, passion fruit, dislike. Apricot, lychee, mango, blueberry. So many different centers. Some that you can bite right through, and some that you can drink, and some that will crack your teeth apart. Writing about seeds means also to write about permission, which could be pretty revolutionary if you think about it. I'm going to follow up this fruit poem with another fruit poem, which is actually the final poem in the book. And then I will read you a new poem. There we go. Mango Mouth. When soft appears, and I mistake the purple rot of the hydrangeas on the counter for their sweetness. Oh, yellow ear, oh, fortitude, oh, urushiol. Toxicodendron radicans sounds like a superhero name. Mangifera, more like what it is, the manhandled feral. And something on the skin of my face cannot tell the difference, and the magic works, and it's inverse, and I break out into the tiniest hives. What speaks like the skin of its own geography? The organ that we leave everywhere, that hunches and furrows, dries and slicks, makes us human or less so. The calculus of touch, the causality of reaction, that burns and prickles, that renders invisible. In the story where my hands push the fruit from its peel, where there's no water at the tap and the stickiness sings like the blown down reeds of the authentic, Contact Dermatitis serves as a book about indulgence, about the taking and taking until you're a swollen mass of the sun that is not yours, of the leaf that is not yours, of the sap that you insist that I insist I can avoid by opening wider around the spoon. I count them on the bones beneath my limbs, things I love that cannot touch my lips. That poem is, I should have given an introduction to that poem because I don't know. Some people immediately know exactly what I'm talking about here because they also have this sort of contact allergy to mangoes, which the reason for that is that the sap of the mango tree is related to the sap of poison ivy and poison oak. And so Toxicodendron radicans here, that's the Latin name for poison ivy. And so if you're allergic to one, it's possible, though not essential, that you will possibly be allergic to the other. Okay, so I actually do have time. This is exciting. So I'm going to read I'm doing this weekend, and I'm also doing ACLA, and so like I'm very conscious of like sticking to time. So this is my concession to that. I'm working on a new book right now that's a very strange mix of sort of like prose and poetry and like kind of exploded poems across multiple pages. But the sort of theme, I suppose, is kind of the history and tropology of melancholy. But I thought I would read this last one because it is sort of related to the poems that I was reading before in a kind of weird way. Like the poems in Brief History deal with the sort of fact of physicality in the body from a kind of cultural perspective, and these poems deal with the fact of having a body from a slightly more abstract or psychological, I guess, perspective. Now, can you separate these two things? Like, not really. But nevertheless, here we are. So I'll read just this one more, and then I will turn it over and look forward very much to hearing Raina's poems. Okay. Historical materialism. Fundamentally, however, I hate the body. This conviction is difficult to reconcile with pleasure, with the slight closure of the eyelids upon the onset of a stiff breeze over water. Nevertheless, that the world acts upon the body with occasional kindness does not, in the end, mitigate the fact that this warehouse has reached capacity. You open the doors and everything spills out readily, having long ago slipped off its shelving. Someone constantly playing the trumpet just to your right, an acre of grass studded with knitting needles, collections of mirrors with their beards of rust. Shopping online for a way to make myself both enticing and shapeless, I know that everyone thinks occasionally about the degree to which shapes are coercive or have been made coercive. The passive voice is both the strength and the greatest weakness of structural analysis. I have been made unsightly. You pick up the mirror, in other words, and it bites into your hands. From the wound sprouts a tiny plant made of sugar cubes. You see, anyone would nurse that. Anyone would worry its sweetness into never healing. All right, I will stop. That's me. Thank you for listening to my work. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very, very much, Kimberly. I think well, let's forget about the spotlighting. I don't know how to work it, obviously. Everyone can do speaker view at home and everything will be fine. Thank you very much, Kimberly, and we will now hear from Raina Leon.
Hey, y'all. I am so happy to be with you. Kimberly, that was a phenomenal reading. I really loved hearing your poems and seeing them, how they're constructed on the page. I just want to offer that to you. So to be with you all is this incredible joy. So my Penn State story, I met Alden when I was an undergrad. I had been English was one of my minors. I majored in journalism, but I had 4 minors. I was really busy. And my honors thesis, I was working on it with Billy Joe Harris, and then he left. And I was like, wait, what happened? And so Alden stepped in, and I was sharing that it was such a fraught and riotous time, because when we also met that first semester was the semester where for so many of us, our lives changed so drastically with 9/11. And I remember having been in his class and the news being on, and then us talking and then leaving that class. Like that remains a part of my vivid memory. And being in that class and feeling safe to talk about my world is shattering, because I have had and have a lot of family in New York, and 2 of my cousins unfortunately died in the Trade Center. So like that poignancy of that moment still is resonant for me. I also share this other piece of my Penn State story, which is I really hope that Penn State students and students beyond, when this is shared after this evening, maybe one person has the same experience that I did, seeing someone from Penn State come back. In my case, it was an MFA graduate, Larray Van Cleef-Stefanen, who's now a professor over at Cornell, right? But she had come to do a reading of her first book, Black Swan. And I tell people the story, how seeing her read changed my life. And I had no money. I was broke, like really broke. and I was like talking with a friend who's still a very good friend about how it was essentially living off of 75 cents a day. And Larray happened to be in front of me. She does this incredible reading. I go to talk to her afterwards, And I was like, I really would love to buy your book, but like, it's not happening. And she gave me a copy of her book. And it was raining. I had no umbrella, but imagine the scene. I'm crying because someone finally sees me. I'm holding the book under my arm to keep it safe. And I missed class the next day. And she told me about Cave Canem, that I should apply. And I got in ultimately. And that changed so much for me. And then many, many years later, I saw her at the Zornier Horston Festival in Eatonville in Florida. And I hadn't seen her since Penn State, since I was, in my early 20s. And I unload this whole story. There are tears involved. And I'm sure she was like, what is going on? But this impact that is possible in the sharing of the word and the bridge that is poetry, especially in these formative times of our lives. So anyway, I'm going to share some poems, mostly new. I'm going to go, I think I'm going to maybe share with you all in the chat the link to the poems, because I'm going to pop all over the place. So, which always happens. So I have an order and then it changes. So here we go. I'm going to tell you before I start, though, that I've been really fascinated by an essay by Toni Morrison, The Site of Memory, and thinking about the impact of water and the returning of water, what water teaches us. And I think about the water as a conduit of memory, water as a connector, and how much of our bodies is in the space of water. And that being this repository for me too of ancestral memory. And I've been writing a lot around ancestral memory, ancestral recovery, family, Black mothering. And the work that I'll read is some from the past, from Boogeyman Dawn, and then mostly from a new project, which is going to come out most likely in the fall from Black Freighter Press. Okay, the first poem is from Boogeyman Dawn. And if you have your hymnal, it is on page 48. Wolf Rock School, October 2006. And it was written after a shooting that happened at an Amish school in that year in Pennsylvania. And I remember thinking, if the Amish ain't safe, nobody's safe. And what are we going to do? There has to be something done. And that was in 2006. 1. Between crop fields that rise golden and whisper when dry, and a husk is all that remains, a white clapboard school sits with a few desks and chairs for the local boys and girls. They come most mornings by horse-drawn buggy or on foot, the boys in dark homespun breeches and straw hats, the girls in their white caps and frocks. They clatter together over wooden planks in heavy-heeled shoes until the day's lesson begins. This is paradise for any child, when the class is small and the schoolhouse as serene as the immense landscape that rises and falls in green grass and autumn leaves in their colorful falling dance. The milkman rides down the road once a week to collect the milk from their parents, which is the only contact most have at this age with the outside world and its machines. Paradise in chalk, paradise in blackboard, paradise in nature. What a place to grow. 2. Shoot me first, said Marion, to save the other girls. He did. Shoot me second, said her sister, but she survived her courage, thank God. 3. A wolf howls from a lone rock that levitates up into the clouds, a woeful sound that circles around the shoulders of weeping mothers like a thin shawl. 5 little girls executed in paradise, the plank boards of the school reddened with blood, and so too the earth below. The milkman came to catch the bounty of the Amish, this time in their children. He must have confused the white-capped girls with the rocking peaks of milk. He thought to dip his finger in here and taste. He pounded 10 eyebolts into a wall spaced 10 inches apart to truss up the girls he kept when he sent the rest away, so that he could touch them in a line. How efficient. A siren wail thwarted his saliva-dripped desire, so he shot the girls and himself. Most execution style, so their blood mixed with his amid crayons and lesson books. For, with these other women, she dresses the girls in white. These children she turned with her own midwife fingers and shepherded into the world. 5. A nearby meeting house stretches its doors for the morning and the candles they bring. Night lingers on longer than usual, and the Amish bow their heads, their whole bodies into prayer. Sam Stolzfus, a grandfather of some of the girls, speaks to the boys who survive. He says, "Do not think this man evil. Their hearts they must resign to God, keep them smooth and untwisted by hate. And to those around him who listen to his husky woodcutter voice, a funeral to us is a much more important thing than the day of birth because we believe in the hereafter. The children are better off than their survivors." The congregation says amen and moans in agreement. This meeting place too is holy. Mothers look to their sons and fathers to their daughters, those who were not there or escaped, and hold them dearer. Wonder how this will change the future while they plan the funerals of Naomi Rose, Anna Mae, Marion, Mary Liz, and Lena. Determine which horses and which buggies will bear them up to heaven. 6. Simple pine boxes with no metal pins in graves dug by hand. All things return to dust. I think it's poignant as well. You probably heard my daughter in the background. But I have been very concerned as an educator long before I was a mother in the nurturing and the space for the flourishing of children. And so in my daughter's contribution to the poem, it reminds me of that again. The Pistol's Confession, which is written in the voice of the gun. It has an epigraph of a song, which may be familiar. Go to sleepy little babe. Go to sleepy little babe. Come lay bones on the alabaster stones and be my ever-loving babe. Go to sleepy little babe. Go to sleepy little babe. You and me and the devil make 3. Don't need no ever-loving babe. All I ever wanted was to be held slick in his grip, wetting me down with want. I wanted to be a vessel for his fire, explosive possibility of the spark, the powder that swallows resolution and spits it out in childish steel. I was born to be a force of reckoning, a force to split and fuse with heat. I was forged to be the forge for smoldering, but never this. I was not shaped for this. His eyes were faulty, but I could see all those pretty little faces. Not pinned to straw, but moving and shifting from smile to grimace. Moving targets, sure, but not those hitched on a motor and dragged left and right, forward and backward. These cowered beneath desks, hid themselves even within their bones. I just wanted to be held, and there he was holding me to fire, to the ecstasy of killing. All those pretty little faces, with my charred mark, my sizzle and burn, they explode just like straw in bits. I teased, seduced with my circle of steel like a ring of promise. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Oh, how I sung for him over the whimpers, the bloody throats gurgling their last prayers. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. I was so good he couldn't help but hold me close, right so he could hear me. I gave him his resolution back. Ashes, ashes. Won't you hold me? Won't you hold me? I just wanted to be held. Okay. You may have to take a deep breath after that. The next poem is The Boogeyman. And it's all around. He's here, and if you have your hymnal, you would turn to page 54 with the epigraph from Carl Nussbaum. Wouldn't it be so much easier if all monsters were ugly? The boogeyman sinks through bogs, travels in crud waters to pristine streams and mirror lakes where cows drink. Milk, symbol for liquid purity, steals the senses. Has the milkman come for your children today? Has the milkman come to your home? He's the boogeyman sent to thieving your children. Outside, they're playing on spring green grass. You call them in for milk and cookies already lost. The shells will return to play outside, but soon enough, the girls are developing breasts at 8. The boogeyman knows all about booby traps, and the boys are growing black wings and pistols for their eyes. The commercials ask you if you have it, and you do. The boogeyman, with his stench, is pale horse white. He flies too on black crows with your plucked eyes in their beaks. Haven't you noticed the mirror has seemed dull? It's the boogeyman who bruises the glass. He visits churches and whispers pishogs to the tune of hymns. He infects the evangelist's husband, the immigrant, the stockbroker, the stay-at-home mother, any mother's child, the recreational addict, the therapist and her patients. The boogeyman bogs you down. Torturous submergence. Your cells have been invaded. It's so easy now to blame the boogeyman. Blame the boogeyman. It's not anyone's fault. Okay. So this next poem is called The Only Color, and it was written after the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. The only color. Verde. Verde, verde, every color is verde. And I think on Federico Garcia Lorca, how I read this poem to him days old, his whole body less than 6 pounds on my chest. And now he stands, a wild octopus boy on a chair reaching for the markers to draw one of the cars he says I always drive. Verde. Verde, he says, though the unkept tool streams orange, and his father says, he knows what the best color is. I say naranja. He has to know his colors and go into a diatribe about school, not being behind. It is not about school. He is my son, and so the box waits, a check mark of abuses woven into his identity. Will he ever be able to just be the creative child who says verde, verde, verde for all the colors and is glorified for how his mind stretches divergent? My husband does not know that the box can be a casket, and each day we must fight for it not to be. Ahmaud ran on a street lined with green leaves. Lorca wrote a poem. They shot him too. So bright, I just want my son to know his colors and live. Another poem where I sing. So between my son and my daughter, there was the emergence of another baby who did not stay. We never talk about this chemical pregnancy. It's a reference as well to Solitary Boat, which is a painting by Ficre Gebrese's, and the song is called Stay, from Carol Maillard of Sweet Honey in the Rock. The clock on the wall says it's time to go, but I know my heart really wants you to stay a while. Hear the seconds ticking by and the world outside is still. So before you have to leave, stay a while with me. In the dream, the knowledge pounced and I felt that I was pregnant again. Woke from sleep and felt the hard secret nut, the uterus in its first swell. Just before sleep, I had seen a shadow dog in the corner between desk and television. I worried it had appeared to mouth your brother's essence and steal it away. I prayed over him, called on his angels and my grandmother as mine for protection. Did it come for you instead? The clock on the wall says it's time to go. Days later, when I learned you were no longer in me, flesh expelled in a blood-tinged webbing of mucus, how the body shows a spoil seed's end before the blossom or fruit. I saw a painting of a lone boat in a dark sea. There were no people. Had they already drowned in their migration across troubled seas, with only the tubing's garish yellow remaining, orbs abandoned to the latest hours, bridge lights lit far off? You who were a being of water and flesh and gold and wind, a breast slip, a gone before a name could fix you. I imagined you swayed in the boat, then a twisted seaweed pat in the tumble of invisible waves, then a pebble that falls too fast to be carried. You were more than a number on a test I begged the doctor to give me, again regarded as insane for knowing my own body. And when she saw the proof, said miracles do happen, as if the miracle was the numbers, my sanity a miracle, as if you were passively placed and not already animate with your own lessons to teach, inform and unforming, as if. I ponder brushstrokes. It may take me a lifetime to understand. Someday I will seek you beyond my eyes' sight. I will give you this poem. I will ask your name. I feel the light around me. You are in that light on gilded water. The clock on the wall. Okay. So I think I have time to read maybe two more poems. Decay, a new poem. Child, I am old and have learned so many rules of what and how to taste. How manufactured foam on a lightly poached egg refines the tongue, while sea sputum twists it to poison. And though gold clogs the intestines to stillness and cements there even in tiny flecks, their glitter going down is like capturing the sun, so they say. And is better than the day star's momentary grace on studded palette, unfolded to sky as if to devour all light. Child, what would you teach me about gluttony swirls like a water vortex in my throat? Would you see your mother a lost pirate in the sea of earthly delights, my fingers grubbed over in grass ball of dirt and crumpled leaves? What is the chemical composition of decay? The slow gift of the rising tree, whose name is hidden in brown detritus. Child, tell me about this second meal. So soon after the grit of the sandbox, and just before the dessert of your own spit, as you suck your fingers. Querida, describe how death ribbons in your mouth and offers you a new pucker and a distinct scrunch to your face. Is this how your first wrinkle of consternation forms? And when I die, will the leaves I eat taste like these I disparage now, thinking them less fine on a menu you sampled of garden? Will my own earth be sweet as I rise to meet them? Okay. And I think, yes, I think these two short ones that I can read. Yeah. Mother Fear. I should also frame these last poems with saying that my daughter was born during this pandemic. She's almost a year now. And when she was born, it was an emergency process. I was supposed to be giving birth in a maternity center, and there would be candles and all the things. But I was suspected of having COVID, and so gave birth in an isolation room. And really, really hard, especially at that time when there was so much discussion around if you went into labor and were suspected of having COVID, many women gave birth alone. And in my case, my partner was able to come with me, but that meant that he couldn't leave. We couldn't leave the room. And we have an older child. So our son for 2 days was supported by our community, and they rose and they supported him, and he was filled with light and love when we returned. But talk about a really challenging birthing experience. Mother fear. There are birds on the water. Feather flight and swirling vortex. You would know her name if you could sing like the nightingale or swift with their tails. There are pretty dark wings that glisten as they set down in a light. They swirl in this body world, set to their spinning by a glint syringe. Science, the magician of creation. All worlds crumble and crash. This one in a dilated door, a being just a murmuration of swallows or a murder under a bloody sheet. I should also tell you that my daughter was born 2 days before George Floyd was murdered. And so there is many of the poems that I'm writing now, that holding of her coming into the world, but also him calling to his mother who was not in this world, right? This last poem. So giving birth during the pandemic as well made it really difficult to be seen for treatment. There's already medicalized racism, but that was compounded. And so I had, this poem talks about that, of not being seen and begging to be seen. Whole. After my first, they said, track marks. As in, he came so fast, he left track marks. Not skid. Track marks. Within a few weeks, I stopped bleeding, a healed highway, clean, black, and rain, skid or attic lane. After my second, they said, a small tear, stitch or silver nitrate. And I chose the chemical. It didn't burn, a newborn, a kind of bone. Weeks again, a highway again, this time pitted and raw. I know exactly where the tear was. Pandemic, no one will examine me. A body is always contagion. The midwife gives me a recommendation for a doctor who will pat my hand. They're there. There's no pain now, right? And also not examine the damned spot. The first time it is a physical therapist, amazed at ambulatory dysfunction. You have a wound, very slight. You need more silver nitrate to heal the skin. That's why you have such pain. And then 3 more weeks to be seen. An appointment almost canceled. I beg to tears over a tear. And when I arrive, my medical records are perused. They're there. She looks hesitantly and sees a wound at touch, bleeds a river on a Q-tip. You still have a tear. The wound isn't healing. We can try this again. But if it doesn't work, we will have to revise it, which means cut a skin sliver wider and deep while I dream my death and sew me tight like a first time when I tell my husband he mourns the loss of my body. In sex, when I left the doctor, I said, nice to meet you. Thanks for burning me. See you soon. And that's my time, y'all. Thank you so much for going with me on this journey. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So much. I was going to change the spotlight again, but why bother? I particularly want to thank our audience for zooming in tonight. And I want to thank Kimberly and Raina for sharing the powers of their words tonight. I haven't had the pleasure of hearing them for so long, and it's really deeply moving to hear them in this time that we're living through. I want to encourage everybody, especially you asynchronous futurists who are watching this later on, to navigate on over to your favorite online bookshop and get A Brief History of Fruit by Kimberly Andrews from the University of Akron Press, and the delightfully titled Sombra Dislocate by Raina Leon from Salmon Poetry. And again, thanks particularly to Raina Leon and Kimberly Andrews for this wonderful reading. And I'm going to stop the recording and thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.